And a very good morning to you live from London. You're listening to Monocle on Sunday with me, Emma Nelson. Coming up today, a stack of guests sharing their views on the week's biggest stories, including Rainbow Murray. Good morning. What have you spotted?
Well, it's the usual mix of male world leaders doing dodgy things to the environment, the economy and the globe, really.
Happy days. We look forward to that. We'll also head to Marseille for the latest news from there.
Hello, this is Mary Fitzgerald, Monocle correspondent in Marseille. I'll be bringing news today from France, including new rules against Airbnb in Marseille.
Plus, we hear from the Monocle Asia editor James Chambers and analyst Richard Shellback from the UBS Australasia Conference in Sydney. It's the 17th of November 2024. Live from London, this is Monocle on Sunday.
Live from London, this is Monocle on Sunday with Emma Nelson.
And a very good morning to you if you have just tuned in. This is Monocle on Sunday, coming to you from a very, very cold and wintry London. Everything is grey. It is incredible. We haven't seen the sun, the sky for days, and it's rather discombobulating. Rainbow Murray, Professor of Politics at Queen Mary University of London. How are you? How's your week been? Good to see you.
Thank you. Good to see you too. My week's been okay. I mean, you talk about how bad the weather is, but to be fair, this is November in London. It's when it's like this in summer that I get miserable. But at this time of year, it just creates an appetite for Christmas, I think. I'm looking forward to the lights going up.
Oh, yes, the lights have gone up in certain parts of town this week. And we were watching... I think it was on Wednesday afternoon, Marylebone decided to sort of fire up the cannons. And I think it was about 4:45. If you wandered around the streets of Marylebone, you very much got the impression that it felt like, you know, when people are coming over and you're not ready and you haven't done anything and you haven't hoovered and you haven't sorted this out and sorted that out. They were my reliable report said that they were still trying to put the lights up at about 4:30. And the switch on was 6. And actually you sort of thought, brilliant, this is sort of small municipal thing. What went wrong? What's that one thing that sort of surprised you and what stopped it from happening?
Well, you could say that, OK, so they weren't quite ready for their 6 p.m. switch on, but at least they were ready well in advance of December, which is when the lights really need to be up. I'm hoping to get a glimpse of Carnaby Street next week. They tend to do an amazing display for anyone who's ever been to London. It's not the most well-known street, but it often has the best lights in the whole of London.
It does. It used to be pretty well-known, and then it's sort of become quite touristy now. But the Carnaby Street lights are really quite amazing. OK, how are we doing? So let's have a look at what's happening in the papers. You started the hour by saying dodgy blokes doing dodgy deals, setting up the world. The listening to the radio at the moment, you don't know what salvo's being thrown out of the speakers every time you hit the top of the hour and there's some news, with Donald Trump hiring the most incredible souls.
Donald Trump, wow. I think we're all still sort of coming to terms with the fact that someone who lost the previous election and tried to overthrow government to steal it back is now legitimately re-entering the White House. And yes, he's assembled a new team. Let's see if they last better than his team in his first term, where it was almost a sort of weekly source of entertainment who's in and out of the White House this week. He's not particularly well known for holding on to his staff, so I think whether the people he's announced now will still be in place by the time he swears office in January remains to be seen.
So who have we seen in the last 24, 48 hours then? Because I think we were all totally sideswiped by RFK Jr.
Yeah,
and that was the sort of the first step along the path to what we thought was going to be happening.
Yes, a conspiracy theorist and anti-vaxxer taking on the health portfolio. Obviously, vaccinations aren't as prominent now as they were during Trump's first term when he was presiding over the COVID pandemic, but no one knew when he was elected that the COVID pandemic was coming. We don't know what's coming in the second term, but someone who is anti-science taking on a position as reliant on science as a health portfolio is obviously quite disconcerting. Interesting, he's also got the youngest ever press secretary coming in.
She's 27.
She is 27. The previous youngest was 29. So that's a bit of an innovation, I suppose. And he has actually got quite a good track record for having female press secretaries. He's also got a good track record having many press secretaries because none of them seems to last more than about a year. So this could be a brief stepping stone, but she certainly seems to be on the same page as him politically.
It's Caroline Leavitt, isn't it, who we're talking to?
Yes.
And she's what was amazing is that she'd been the national press secretary on Trump's campaign. Yep. So she'd obviously masterminded this and was clearly very, very good at what she does. But she's also assistant press secretary during his first administration, which was, 8 years ago. I mean, she must have been early 20s by the time she'd got into that.
She was. I mean, she was doing this sort of alongside her college degree. She was really a very young and enthusiastic member of his team. And so almost sort of straight out the bat, as soon as she'd finished education, she was off to Washington to fulfill her dreams. And then she went off and worked for another senior politician before herself having a run for Congress. She didn't make it, but I think she would probably be quite happy with this as an alternative career landing.
Not so bad at all. I mean, Donald Trump went through how many press secretaries in his first tenure? So
4, I believe.
He went through 4. So Sean Spicer, Sarah Sanders, Stephanie Grisham and Kayleigh McEnany. They effectively just stand there and are basically this, not just the guardrail and the guard dog, but they just take the thumps. They punch the punches on the nose, don't they?
They do. And sometimes the actual storylines coming out of a Trump administration are such farce that it feels a little Orwellian. You know, they have to say one thing one day and then sort of defend something rather contradictory the next. But they always have the same defence line, which is that the mainstream media is biased against them, is hostile, is attacking them for no good reason. So if they are the ones at fault, they just blame it on the negative spin or the lies of pretty much anyone in the press room.
In terms of, let's sort of delve a little bit deeper in terms of if there is any political theory behind this, given the fact that, I mean, as a professor of politics, yes, you specialise in Europe, but we'll come to that in a minute. But when you are watching the Trump playbook being rerun, but this time with a heck more preparation, more money, sharper focus, where are they getting the ideas from?
I think they're getting some of their ideas, believe it or not, from Putin. Not saying that America is about to become the new Russia. They're obviously very different people with very different agendas. But Trump has spoken of his admiration for dictators and autocrats. And I think in this particular way that I'm referencing it, I think it's a like for disinformation. A sort of a post-truth world. We know that Trump is extremely economical with the truth and likes to lie big, to lie frequently. I think even his staunchest supporters would recognise that not everything that he says is entirely honest. But the purpose of this isn't necessarily to get people to believe the lies. It's to get people to stop believing anything. That people stop trusting authority, people stop trusting what they read in the newspapers. Because if people no longer believe anything, you can get away with anything.
It's a difficult thing to do when you have to become president because people have to believe in you, won't they? I mean, what kind of... There's a really interesting article in the New York Times today about Trump's cabinet picks that we were just talking about just then. From outside, from within Washington, and from across the rest of the world, there is universal outcry that someone like RFK Jr. and we'll come to the energy secretary pick in a moment, a fracking fan. But the New York Times has marked out that where Donald J. Trump's critics see underqualified nominees with questionable judgment, his voters are describing them as mavericks recruited to shake up Washington. That's a huge thing, isn't it? Because Trump is doing what his supporters want him to do. Yeah, I mean,
this sort of goes back to what I was saying about a post-truth world and not trusting anybody. So someone who is an anti-vaxxer, that's someone who has an inherent distrust of the normal authority that we hear from sort of the scientific establishment saying that vaccines are good for us, and here's someone saying, I don't trust that. I am suspicious of the official line. And I think generally Trump supporters are suspicious of the establishment, of authority, of the status quo. And it's a little ironic that Donald Trump, who is an extremely wealthy white man, almost the sort of epitome of inherited wealth and power, is seen as someone who's an outsider, who's someone who's anti-establishment, who's willing to take it to authority. But he's very much modelled himself on that. He has, ironically, a bit of a victim complex. You know, the world's out to get me, and the mainstream media are always attacking me, and everything that goes wrong, it's because other people are unfair to me rather than any of my own failings. And I think that speaks to a generation within America who feel a little bit disinherited, feel a little bit resentful of the fact that the world around them has changed, that things that they thought ought by rights to be theirs are now expected to be shared with others. And they're trying to reassert that sense of self, that sort of sense of importance and power. They don't want to share. They don't want to be told that they're wrong. And I think Trump makes them feel empowered again in a way that they don't under a more egalitarian regime.
And also because people sometimes enjoy a bit of a wild ride, which is what we're sort of looking at. And this article in the New York Times talks about how they've trawled across the likes of of Florida and North Carolina to talk to Trump voters. And one person who runs a tattoo business says what Trump is doing is a masterpiece. If it was a painting, it would be a Picasso, a star cast to somebody else. And someone says, I think it's crazy and I love it. That speaks not just to the fact that Trump is taking very, very seizing the opportunity to smash things up with a hammer, but also that there is this dissatisfaction with the way that things are. And we have to ask, obviously, there was something that Biden-Harris got wrong.
Yes.
What was it that they got wrong that made people just not warm to them, have any connection with them? And, OK, Trump is irresistible in many ways because he's a bright, shiny, sparkling character who grabs attention. But there must have been something that in terms of perception, that people pushed against.
Yes. I mean, if you say that Trump is the anti-establishment candidate, then Biden embodied and embraced the establishment. You know, he wanted to restore the old ways of doing things in a sense. And there was a certain smug elitism of which the Democrats have often stood accused that looked down, I think, on certain parts of America. I think one of the most painful mistakes made in the Democratic campaign, and it was made by Biden, not by Harris, was when he responded to a comment that Trump had made talking about Puerto Rico as garbage. He referred to Trump voters as garbage. And a lot of people who weren't necessarily hardcore Trump supporters but undecided, that would have sat really badly with them. That just spoke to a general contempt for large swathes of the electorate. But I think it's also worth remembering that the majority of people who voted for Donald Trump are not hardcore Trump supporters. They don't necessarily like him. They don't necessarily think that he has integrity or honesty, or, they don't necessarily go with any of that. But it goes back to what Clinton said many years ago when trying to explain American voting. It's the economy, stupid. Basically, during the 4 years in which Biden was in office, people did not have the economic feel-good. Inflation soared, purchasing power declined, employment increased, but a lot of the investment that went into the American economy was long-term investment. And people aren't interested in the long term, they're interested in the right now. And right now, people are hurting.
And long-termism is something which is really a decreasing phenomenon, isn't it? Not just because of the way that the political cycles work, but in terms of our perception and our demand for immediate change. And I wonder whether the bench is always set by the first 100 days. That when you start to put something like that on an administration, and if they haven't made the world a better place within 100 days, they've failed. It sort of sets the mark for a political system which doesn't actually have any room in it to get it right or to think in the next 10, 15, 20 years?
No, I mean, good government doesn't happen in the first 100 days. Good government is about long-term planning and trying to make sometimes tough decisions that improve things over a longer period of time. And so it's quite possible that some of the foundations that got laid during the Biden administration will actually come to fruit during the Trump administration, for which Trump will most certainly then seek to take credit. But Trump was fortunate in that things went relatively well in terms of the global economy during his tenure. And then the real hit of the sort of the post-COVID aftermath came during the Biden years, along with the economic shockwaves caused by the war in Ukraine. And so those weren't necessarily the fault of the Biden administration, but Biden certainly got blamed for them. That question that Trump kept asking, are you better off now than you were when I was president? A lot of people ask themselves that question when asked. And the answer was no. And as long as that's the case, they're going to think, well, yeah, I was better off before. Let's go back to that.
Rainbow Murray, stay with us. We normally have two panellists today on Monocle on Sunday. We were supposed to be having David Bodanis, but unfortunately he's fallen ill. So we send him our very, very best. And in the meantime, it's up to you, me, Rainbow. And also, we're going to have a little bit of a trip now to Sydney. Monocle has been in Australia for the last couple of weeks, taking a well-deserved return. I think it's been about 7 years since Monocle really properly went out there and did what it could. And it's great because we have an enormous, a really sizable following of Monocle people in Australia. So thank you so much. And it's good to see you all again. And this week, the Monocle team was decamping to Sydney for the UBS 2024 Australasia Conference. UBS gathered industry leaders, policymakers and innovators to explore how topics such as productivity, healthcare and technology may affect our economy and investment landscape into the future. Well, our Asia editor, James Chambers, heard from the UBS analyst Richard Shellbach talking about key issues impacting Australia and how the country differs from Europe and Asia. They began by asking whether the average Australian feels they still live in a lucky country.
Not to the same extent as may have been the situation in the past. And what is certainly sort of mapped out through developed economies is a situation where, because of inflation and asset price appreciation, certain people are more wealthy than ever. And that's largely because of the move up in home prices and also equity markets to a lesser extent. But the wage earner has somewhat been left behind because the income gains that they're getting in their wages have not been able to keep pace with asset price appreciation, be it with home prices and also with standard sort of consumer goods. So basically, people may be told that they're wealthier than they've ever been, but they go to the grocery store and are paying 20 or 30% more for that basket of goods than they were 4 years ago. And therefore they feel like they've gone backwards. And to a certain extent, that creates some frustration and disillusionment and leads to, electoral sort of outcomes that we're increasingly seeing.
We had the big election in the US, but we have a big election in Australia next year. We're still a long way away, but what are the types of issues that you think are going to be on voters' minds?
Look, I think the types of issues that will play out over the next 6 months as we head into the Australian federal election are much the same as what was seen in the US election. That is, the consumer out there is frustrated with inflation and the cost of living challenges that they've seen. They don't feel like they're getting wealthier, they feel like they're getting poorer. So economic matters, cost of living, absolutely, that will be key.
Australia, at least from outside of these shores, has always been perceived as somewhere that's very tough on immigration. I mean, immigration's become a huge issue in places like the UK and the US. Will it be a big talking point here in the election next year?
Look, it will be a talking point, but I'm not sure if it will be the talking point to the extent that it was, in the US election or in various sort of European elections. The Australian public is pro-migration because this has always been an economy that is built off migrants. That's nothing new. The somewhat pushback that the voter may have against the pace of migration is not about necessarily migration and multiculturalism. It is about the fact that possibly the migration program has allowed population growth to run at a pace in excess of where the infrastructure and housing construction has been.
One of the big issues in many countries in Asia Pacific is the transfer of wealth. Founders are some in their 80s and 90s are starting to kind of pass away, and the companies are being handed over to the next generations. How much is that a big thing? We've all been watching Succession and I've heard that it's loosely based on Mr. Murdoch, but more broadly, how much is that a big topic down here?
The real story in Australia in terms of generation wealth transfer is within the housing market. And that isn't necessarily millionaires or billionaires, but it's what would have been considered middle-class Australians who, because of 30 years of house price appreciation, are now maybe in their 70s and 80s living in a 4-bedroom house that's worth $3 or $4 million. They don't need a house that big. They obviously don't need much income day to day anymore because they don't have a mortgage. And as those people move on, that asset will be transferred to another generation. Now, it's creating a society of haves and have-nots, because obviously if you are on that inheritance path, your sort of financial future and security is in a totally different situation to the ones that don't receive that. So it's a challenge for governments to navigate that. And it's something that obviously governments are aware of, because it's a story that 10 years ago was something that maybe actuaries or statisticians talked about, but now it's front and centre, and it's something that will be influential in sort of deciding the outcome of elections.
Coming from a European perspective, where we've long ago kind of given up on having a state pension and looking forward to a golden retirement, why is Australia so well funded?
It was a system that was set up over 30 years ago with a lot of vision, and they were brave in terms of making the moves. Something that Australia did that was quite counter to European systems at the time was, firstly, commit to a defined contribution system. So defined contribution systems were deemed as being far more better aligned in terms of the worker, the company paying the pension payments, and governments over a long term. The second thing that really made the Australian superannuation system successful is it's always had a very long-sighted asset allocation structure that acknowledged that, yes, asset markets go up and down from year to year, but over the medium to long term, to generate a return, you've got to take risk. And to take risk, that means you've got to be in risk assets, i.e. listed equity markets. So the Australian superannuation system still maintains over 50% of its holdings in listed equity markets, and that's really counter to some of the pension systems in Europe, where the allocation towards listed equities is below 20%, and they've had a far higher preference for those fixed income payments. So the capital markets here are far more supported in terms of equity capital versus what you've seen in Europe, and also the ultimate returns that the fund holders have in our pension system has been far stronger because it's been so allocated towards risk assets, in other words, equities.
And finally, as we move towards the end of the year and look ahead at 2025, how do you feel about next year? And is there anything in particular you're looking forward to?
Look, we're cautiously optimistic on the next year. We think that companies will grow profits as the rate cutting cycle comes through in the middle of next year, when the RBA is in motion in terms of its rate cutting profile. The economy is on a good footing here. Where we are somewhat concerned are just the valuations on equities. They, to a large extent, have already priced in a lot of that optimism. And what it means is that earnings growth really needs to come through. And for the best companies, they are able to generate earnings growth because they're gaining market share off their competitors. They're able to manage costs and support their profit margins. But for many companies out there that maybe aren't the strongest operator in their business line, they are still being challenged by the sort of high interest rate environment, the sticky cost environment, and just the overall sort of competitive landscape. So for the best companies, I think they will continue to thrive. But if you're not at the top of your game, the cost challenges will continue to be a headwind.
That was Richard Shellback there, the UBS equity analyst, talking to James Chambers at the event, the UBS 2024 Australasia Conference in Sydney. You're listening to Monocle on Sunday with me, Emma Nelson, joined in the studio by the political academic, Rainbow Murray. Very good. Welcome and thank you for your company today. Rainbow, let's talk about COP29. This amazing revelation that came this week about how fossil fuel executives were there effectively touting for business at what should be the climate change conference. I mean, the wheels really have come off here, haven't they?
They really have. It's pretty shameful. I mean, if there's one thing that COP29 ought to be achieving, it's trying to help the world wean itself off fossil fuels. We know we've got to do it. We know that we cannot reach the target agreed in Paris 2015 of trying to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees over this century if we continue to burn fossil fuels. And if we don't hit that target, then some of the catastrophes that we're already seeing, I mean, even this week we've seen catastrophic flooding in Spain and more still to come. And every week it seems to be another environmental catastrophe around the world. But the rate at which this is going to change is really going to escalate if we go above that 1.5 critical limit. So we know that we need to be dialing it down. And instead, here we are in Azerbaijan having a COP29 led by people who are saying, no, let's dial it up. Natural gas is a gift from God and we should make the most of it. So they're not just going a little bit off message. They're taking an urgent step in one direction and saying, no, let's run in the complete opposite instead.
It is absolutely phenomenal when you actually look at the breakdown of what's happened here. Apparently 1,700 coal, oil and gas lobbyists were granted access to COP29, outnumbering the delegations of almost every single company. It's an astonishing thought that it's a choice of location, which is always the big question when it comes to COP. OK, we had Glasgow, we had Egypt, we had Cairo. But then in the last 2 years, we've had the UAE, where the number of delegates was phenomenal, not least because it's warm and sunny and it's November, and one wonders how many people were sort of going over there thinking, well, let's get a little boost of vitamin D. But then when you go to Baku, into Azerbaijan, which has such a huge economic reliance on fossil fuels, you sort of wonder, you can see why they've been chosen, but at the same time you wonder why Baku was chosen.
But then also UAE. I mean,
yeah.
they're an economy that relies on petroleum. So it's the same problem. And this has led some very significant authorities on this, including the former UN Secretary General, to say that COP29 is no longer fit for purpose. I mean, it's no longer, well, not just COP29, but the COP process generally is no longer adequate to achieve what we're trying to do. When we think about the urgency of addressing climate change, we all see this as a long-term problem because it's something that affects our future, but it's also something that affects our present, and it's something that we need to be dealing with right now. And so getting together once a year in a situation where it seems like the voices of the most powerful and the most vested interests trying to ensure the continued reliance on fossil fuels outweigh the voices of those island states whose very existence is under existential threat from climate change. It's not going to solve this problem anymore.
There needs to be a change of narrative as well, a change of perception, given the fact that you talked about the smaller islands which are experiencing the sharp end of climate change and whose livelihoods are being destroyed. Villages are having to be moved, and people are experiencing climate change in a very, very powerful way. I wonder why that story is not being told when, OK, fossil fuel companies have quite a big, deep pockets, ability to be absolutely everywhere. But the climate change activism line is still dominated by pictures, dare I say it, of teenage girls with long hair holding handwritten cardboard signs. I mean, that just looking at the way that the papers are covering it at the moment, the pictures that you get are all sort of like Greta Thunberg version, Mark 2.2. What's going wrong here? Because one wonders whether if the pro-climate change or the climate change campaigners had a slightly sharper look, and I hate to say this, looked a bit more convincing and looked as if they carried a bit more heft, then perhaps there would be a slightly different perception of them, and people would feel that they're a bit more relevant.
It's two problems, I think. The first is a massive power imbalance, and the second is the difference between now and the future. So in terms of the power imbalance, the people who have the power, the people who have the money, are the people with the vested interests in maintaining the status quo, the people whose livelihoods depend on fossil fuels. And they've got huge resources. They're the people who can show up at these summits with their private jets and their chauffeur-driven limousines, and the irony there is not lost on me. Whereas the teenagers don't have these resources. They can only afford their little cardboard signs, but they're the ones whose future is at stake. A lot of the people now trying to sabotage the efforts to get rid of fossil fuels, they'll probably be dead by the time the worst impacts of this are happening. For these teenagers, it's their future. Of course they're going to fight for it. And that's the second problem I was talking about, the difference between the right now and the future. That generally, I'd say probably the biggest weakness of humanity as a species is that we tend to put an emphasis on the right now over the future. We were referring to this as well with Donald Trump, that, the first 100 days, that people want to see what's happening immediately. They're not interested in long-term investment. But it's very much the case with climate change as well. If you make changes right now to your lifestyle, you feel it right now. And if you do that to sort of try and safeguard the future, you might say, well, why should I suffer now to protect the world after I'm dead and gone? And so a lot of people are more concerned with maintaining their lifestyles right now. But when you talk about those little climate states, those little island states whose existence is at threat, they don't have much power. They don't have much voice. But to them, the impacts are huge. And the problem we have is that those who do have a lot of power and resources are more interested in trying to buy off people who are suffering the effects and saying, well, maybe we can look at how to mitigate the effects of climate change to support these, or maybe we can try and get rid of some of these greenhouse gases by sort of sucking them out of the air or whatever, rather than trying to stop producing them in the first place, because stopping producing them in the first place affects their livelihood, and they have a massive vested interest in ensuring that doesn't happen.
The time is 17:32 if you're listening in Beijing, 10:32 in Nice, 9:32 a.m. here in London. You with Monocle on Sunday. Joining me in the studio is Rainbow Murray, flying solo with me this morning with our other guest, David Badanis, rather poorly. We wish him well. Let's head to Marseille now to look at the latest news. Mary Fitzgerald, Monocle's correspondent in the region. Good morning, Mary. You're with us for the next half hour. Thank you so much. Welcome.
Good morning, Emma.
Good to have you with us. Right, what news from where you are?
Well, news from Marseille specifically. One thing that has been causing quite a few flutters, we can say, in the city in the last couple of weeks are new rules and regulations governing Airbnb here. Our mayor has vowed that he is going to basically ensure that Marseille has the strictest regulations on Airbnb in France. And this issue, like, of course, other cities around the Mediterranean, around Europe more generally, has caused a lot of tension in Marseille in recent years. Local figures basically say that last year there were almost 13,000 properties in Marseille which were rented out seasonally, and that was an increase of 45% on the previous year. And what we've seen is growing tensions in terms of discontent. There's a housing crisis in Marseille, so the proliferation of Airbnb has really caused a lot of anger and frustration. And what has been interesting in the last couple of years is to see how anti-Airbnb sentiment here has been manifested. It's been quite militant, we can say. So anti-Airbnb activists have at times broken into properties that are being used for Airbnb and spray painted the walls. They have also poured glue into the keyholes of properties that are being used for Airbnb. So, there was an upping of the ante in terms of the frustrations, local frustrations and anger, and the City Hall is now clearly trying to address that. One of the key elements of what they're proposing is that basically you could only use Airbnb, or you could do Airbnb on your primary residence, not a secondary residence. And They're also proposing that if you already have a second residence that you're using for Airbnb, you buy another property that you then rent out for long-term rentals. So it'll be interesting to see how this is implemented. Marseille is a city that is rather notorious for poor implementation of a whole range of regulations. So it'll be very interesting to see how they fare with this one.
We've seen lots of stories in the last few months and years about over-tourism and people taking direct action to do this. And it's generally the sort of the hotspots, the Florences, the Venices and the Madrids of this world. I mean, how much is Marseille a victim of over-tourism? And what is the general effect when you're walking around the streets when you have a city full of Airbnb? Do you notice the fact that there is a perpetual trundle of cases on the pavement?
Well, it's been fascinating for me, if not amusing, to see the changes in Marseille in recent years. I've been visiting the city for over 20 years and made it my home in 2017. And I remember the days not so long ago when Marseille was a city that people tended to avoid. It had a poor reputation. But in recent years, it's become, very hip. It has a great food scene. A lot of Parisians moved here during the pandemic. And this has really reinvented the city in many ways. And it has caused, I think, overseas visitors to rediscover it and see that it is a special place in many ways and very different to other large French cities. What has been interesting is the debate locally about tourism. This is a city with high rates of unemployment, particularly youth unemployment. So tourism and services industry more generally are seen by some here as a key part of addressing that challenge of unemployment. There are others who basically believe that Marseille should push back against tourism, any kind of tourism. And then there are those who believe that Marseille should embrace tourism, but sustainably. And of course, there's a big debate about how one would define sustainable tourism for a place like Marseille. It's funny you mentioned the roller suitcases, because this has become a symbol of the anti-Airbnb movement here in Marseille. So whenever they've had demonstrations against Airbnb, they ask people to bring roller suitcases along with them. And there were protests last year where they actually created this kind of effigy, if you like, of a roller suitcase and burnt it symbolically. So it's become a symbol of the movement here.
What seems to be interesting there, when you talked about the three different positions, is this is something which has been very intensely politicised, and the question needs to be asked, is there someone with a cool head who actually can take a very measured judgment over the benefits versus the challenges when it comes to tourism and what it can and cannot bring to Marseille?
Indeed. I mean, we have, since 2020, our city hall has been run by a Green Left coalition after 25 years of a kind of centre-right dispensation under one mayor who stayed in place for 25 years. And so the current city hall is very much, of course, embracing an environmental agenda, more sustainable agenda. The mayor has basically pushed back against cruise ships docking in Marseille. He's argued, for example, that the pollution that they cause far outweighs any benefits in terms of revenues that they bring to the city. So there are many different aspects to this conversation. I think, though, at the City Hall generally, there is a feeling that tourism is good for Marseille. It's part of the economy here. It's an important part of the economy. It can be further grown as long as it's done in a sustainable way.
Rainbow, let's bring you in here. I mean, I don't know how many trips you've made to Marseille and how many times you've trundled your case down the streets to an Airbnb, but this is a sort of a bigger problem that the world is trying to deal with. The world is accessible. We can get to places easily, cheaply. It's fun. We're exploring beautiful, beautiful cities. What do you think of the way that Marseille is taking this sort of not zero tolerance approach, but is cracking down?
I think Marseille is trying to protect itself and its identity. But I think there's a difference between trying to stop tourism and trying to ensure that it's done in a a sustainable way that is good for the local city. So I completely understand what's being said about, stopping cruise ships, for example. That's not just Marseille. That's an issue in a lot of cities and countries around the world where cruise ships turn up, but they don't necessarily have a beneficial effect on the local economy. It's a sort of very overpopulation for a very short amount of time. People don't necessarily spend much money and then they disappear and go off on their way again. And with the Airbnb issue, of course, normally when tourists come, they'll stay in a hotel. It's a designated space intended to host people who are visiting. Whereas if you have it in a residential space, which most Airbnbs are, people who are on holiday are not necessarily going to be quiet at 9 in the evening because putting their children to bed. It disrupts neighbourhoods. It creates a different vibe, which can be quite difficult. And we see also sometimes tourism can be a little bit kind of punctuated, that it can hit areas quite hard. I saw stories recently about places that have been made famous due to television or film using it as a location, and then suddenly lots and lots of people turn up to visit that place, but it's too small.
This is the Paddington problem.
This
is a street in Primrose Hill.
Not only, but yes.
Where there is, I think Airbnb have struck up in... can't remember the name of the street, but it's a very well-known one.
Yeah.
And neighbours, people just trying to go about their daily life, have found a gazillion Instagrammers and influencers all taking slightly pouty selfies on their doorsteps and finding it all rather odd and also a little bit too intrusive. I mean, this is an extreme, though.
It's very intrusive. And if you're also talking about, there's a town somewhere in Scotland that they used to film the Hogwarts Express for Harry Potter films. And there isn't the infrastructure to cope with this sudden influx of tourists. They don't have the toilets, for example. You don't want coach loads of tourists sort of turning up and desecrating the area, shall we say, and then going on their way. So it needs to be done in a way that's sustainable. And so you can understand why Marseille is keen to preserve the integrity of the city and also make sure it's livable for its residents, while still trying to benefit from the economic advantages that tourism can bring.
Let's move on to a story which has been dominating the headlines, the trial of Marine Le Pen. Do you want to kick this off, Rainbow? And we'll come to you, Mary, on how this is being seen. But just lay out the case for us, would you mind, Rainbow?
Sure. So before she became a member of the French Parliament, Marine Le Pen used to be a member of the European Parliament. And in that capacity, she was given money to spend on an assistant to work with her, as were a number of her fellow far-right MEPs. And this money was not allegedly spent as intended, but instead used for party political purposes. And so it was misappropriated. And now she's on trial for this, for abuse of several million euros worth of funds. And she risks a prison term, and perhaps even more importantly, she risks being ineligible to run for office for 5 years. And the prosecution have said that should be the case even if she appeals the conviction. It should have immediate effect if she's found guilty. And what that means is that she wouldn't be able to run in the next presidential election. So she's saying this is politically motivated. It's all about trying to bankrupt her party and deny the French population the right to vote for her, whereas the prosecution is saying you committed a crime and no one's above the law.
Mary, in Marseille, which is the south of France, is the Le Pen heartland. How is this going down?
Well, in Marseille, I have to say Marseille is an outlier when it comes to the south of France. As you said, south of France is a bastion of Le Pen's party, has been for decades. But Marseille is different and tends to have a different kind of political color, usually more kind of on the left. So it's really interesting. I was at a dinner last night, and Le Pen's the story was a key part of the conversation. It was really interesting. Nobody around the table would ever vote for Le Pen, but there was a real debate over whether this could inadvertently, if she is banned from running, boost the fortunes of her party, the electoral fortunes of her party. And what we have kind of coming in from the wings is her own protege, Jordan Bardella, who was in the news this week because at the grand old age of 30, he has published his memoir. And there was a book signing event in Brussels. He's a member of the European Parliament. and there were protests outside this book signing and a number of arrests as well. So Bardella he's basically the president of Le Pen's party, and he's considered a rising star. He ran as the party's prime ministerial candidate in the snap legislative elections we had this summer, and he is riding high essentially as the president of a party that now holds more assembly seats than at any moment in its history, and it's the largest single party in the lower house of the assembly. So the fear is that if Le Pen is banned, then this leaves the way open for Bardella to run. So it's and also this kind of fear that it would kind of energize the party base, because already the way they're trying to frame this trial is, and this question of whether she might be banned from running for political office, it's basically the victim thing. So we're kind of seeing, there's been conversations in France and commentaries in France over the last week, kind of comparing this with what happened with Trump and raising the question over whether, criminal convictions may in fact boost the electoral fortunes of Le Pen, as they seem to do with Trump. It would be an interesting thing that you've already mentioned, Rainbow, the idea of Donald Trump as portraying himself as the victim in all this. And this was the narrative that was very much the course when Trump was convicted earlier this year. There is the interesting idea, though, that Le Pen, to have what was the Front National now being rebranded and reborn in the guise of Jordan Bardella, and lots of sort of purification and cleaning when it comes to the far right's party, how it would survive without a Le Pen, because there has been a Le Pen at the helm of this since it started.
There has. It's a family dynasty. It was all founded by Marine Le Pen's father, Jean-Marie Le Pen, and there was always an expectation that she would inherit the party, and that even though Bardella has been leading it for the last couple of years, he was really just keeping the seat warm for her to come and return and contest this election. But I think it is true. I mean, he's a young, dynamic candidate who, in many ways, I think has more going for him than she does. And so whilst it might seem like a catastrophe for her, it isn't necessarily a disaster for her party. And we have seen as well, exactly as you said, the manipulation of these kinds of stories by Trump, for example, trying to make any accusations against him be seen as politically motivated. And it's a sensitive issue because there are occasions where political candidates are falsely accused of crimes as a way of disenfranchising them. I mean, we've seen that in Russia, for example. It's a frequent tactic used by Putin to arrest his opponents under trumped-up charges to stop them running against him. But of course, when the charges are real, when the candidate actually has committed the crime, trying to claim that it's politically motivated is a way of trying to be above the law. So what we're really relying on is a fair and honest implementation of the law. And when the entire legal process gets undermined for political reasons, that again erodes trust in public institutions, which is very dangerous.
Let's move on to a story. We've got a hard-working lot in France, haven't we, Mary? You're very, very good at working to time and working to hours and enjoying your days off as much as you enjoy your time at work. Arguably one of the better balanced nations when it comes to this. But there is a call now from the right wing for you hard-working French to give up one of your rather handsomely numbered public holidays. What's going on here? This is a scandal.
Indeed, it's causing ructions here. This proposal. So basically, France. There are currently 11 public holidays in France, and with France's economic situation the way it is, it's facing a deficit of the deficit could reach 6% by the end of the year. Major changes have to be made. And Michel Barnier, the Prime Minister, has been warning about this since he was appointed some months ago. So there's a budget basically in front of the Assembly, in front of the Parliament right now, budget proposal. And one of the elements proposed is basically removing one of those public holidays. And basically those who are proposing this, including right-wing MPs, are saying that this would save a considerable amount every year. Now, it's not the first time the French have lost a public holiday. In 2004, Whit Monday was basically transformed into what the French call a day of solidarity in order to further boost the state coffers. So basically, with this, if this goes ahead, losing a second public holiday, when there's the debate this week, some people were saying, well, what about November 11th, Armistice Day? Others were aghast at that, pointing out the symbolism of Armistice Day here in France. So this is a debate that rumbles on. But I have to say that I haven't met anybody over the last week who supports this in any way. As you said, the French are very wedded to this idea of their holiday time and their precious time off.
I do like, however, Rainbow, the idea that you turn this into a solidarity day, that there does still remain, if this is the correct approach, a commitment by the French people to the idea of a nation that thrives. And I wonder how many other countries would say, give up a working day to help the government pull its budget together. I think, you might get a few slightly stronger words from, let's say, the United Kingdom or the United States. But is there something in the French psyche that there is that sort of togetherness and, French spirit? I see Mary, she's pulling a face. Rainbow.
I think Solidarity Day was a clever act of political spin to try and polish a turd, if you'll forgive my expression. I think no one likes losing a public holiday, but France is in a painful situation at the moment, which a number of other governments around the world are also facing, where they overspent during the COVID pandemic. They then got hit by the post-COVID inflation and by the war in Ukraine, and they've got no money. And there are generally two ways out of that dilemma. You tax more and you spend less. And so, Barnier's put it to his government, well, which taxes do you want me to raise then? Because no one wants taxes to go up. And then when they said none of them, he said, well, then what areas shall I cut? And no one wants to cut public spending. And if you can't do either of those, you've got to find more money from something. French don't want to raise the retirement age, and they're pushing back against that. So there's all kinds of budgetary restrictions. They can't borrow anymore. And so you try to find a way of doing something a little bit creative. One day in 365 doesn't sound quite so bad. And if you try and spin it as a solidarity day, a way for working people to support those around them, people still aren't going to like it, but at least it sounds more noble.
Are they swallowing this, Mary?
It's what Rainbow has just outlined there. I mean, these are the pros and cons that have been discussed over the last week or so. But as I said, I haven't met anybody who thinks this is a good idea. This is precious. It's sacred for the French. And I think this will be very difficult to push through.
Right. Let's move on to something that caught the headlines at the end of last week. The Académie Française is a hallowed, esteemed institution, part of French culture, French identity. It also has a very nice building near the banks of the Seine, and it is, dare I say it, it's sort of like the bulwark. It's the bastion of good language, and yet it takes its time. It's just issued its last dictionary since, I think the last one it did was in 1937. It has taken these guys the best part of 8 decades to write a new dictionary, which was presented last week to the President Emmanuel Macron. Mary, it's not gone down without it's not been universally received with plaudits, has it?
Indeed. And I think, first of all, it's important to note that when it comes to language and the evolution of language, of course, as how languages evolve tell us so much about the societies in which the language is used. And I think the French language in particular, the changes come very, very slowly, and they're agonized changes as well. And I think the fact that it has taken so long for the Academy to issue this dictionary says something. So there's a lot of commentary in France in terms of the words that have been included and those that have not been included. There have been basically words that are kind of already kind of out of date, if you like. So some observers have been noting that yuppie is one of the new words, sauna as well, which is a little odd. Le wokeism, a term which is very controversial in France, is in there, as is vegan, arguably another controversial term in France, and télétravail, remote working, which of course became a thing from 2020. And it's interesting because in recent years, the French have been tied up in knots about the question of gender in their language and how that reflects or not contemporary reality. So there's a big debate over what the French call inclusive language. So you will see in certain contexts basically inclusive language with kind of full stops or periods in between to kind of reflect the two genders at the same time. It looks awful. It drives many people crazy, but it's an attempt to make the French language more inclusive in terms of reflecting current realities. What is interesting is that, you know, the reactions to this dictionary, and it is fair to say that the Academy is seen as a rather stuffy institution. I mean, it's respected for what it is, but rather stuffy and kind of not in keeping with contemporary France. So, you know, the members of the Academy are known as the Immortels, the Immortals, which kind of gives you a sense of...
Well, they look about the right age, don't they?
Indeed. And all of a particular age, indeed. And but also it's a sense of me because the French language, particularly over the last 10, 15 years, you know, the impact, as with other languages, of the social media, tech speak, all of that, and the debate over how that is changing the French language. Also the influence of immigration. So France has always had, you know, a very rich culture of slang and argot, and that has become even more rich in recent years because of all these changes. Now, there are some people in France who are horrified by those changes and deplore what they see as a loss of what they valued about the French language. And there are others who argue that this is a natural evolution for French as it is for other languages,
Mary,
and is something to be embraced.
I'm going to bring in Rainbow for the last word on this because you actually specialise in gender and French. We have a bare minute to explain. What are the Academy getting right and wrong here?
Well, first of all, I mean, the Oxford English Dictionary updates every year because language evolves constantly. So they're getting it wrong that they're not keeping up with trends. In the French language, any plural group of people is defined in the masculine. Even if it's 9 women and 1 man, it's still defined as a sort of male pronoun.
Which is easy when you're trying to learn it as a foreign language.
So that's what inclusive language is trying to correct. It's trying to recognise the women in the group. But it is messy. They don't have any pleasant way of doing it. I will say I was amused by the comment about vegan. I've been vegan most of my life, and living in the 90s in France, they had a word végétalien, which means kind of plant-based, which has actually now become a more trendy way to describe vegan anyway. So it's come full circle. And that speaks to the problem we have here, that language needs to keep changing to recognise societal norms, and that's what the Académie Française have struggled to keep up with.
And that brings us to the end of Monocle on Sunday. The warmest of thanks to all my guests, Rainbow Murray and Mary Fitzgerald. The programme was produced and studio engineered by Mariella Bevan. I'm Emma Nelson. Monocle on Sunday returns next week. It's from Zurich. Tyler's in charge. But until then, enjoy the rest of your weekend. Goodbye. Thank you for listening.